So go ahead and test your audio.
I have a Russian friend and a Czech one too. And a Czech one too.
Oh no.
Oh man.
That should just be the start. Welcome to The Maker's Playbook, the podcast where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, Rebecca Ikes Kara. Hey Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here. You're doing a terrible job pretending that we just didn't talk for the past 10 minutes.
I can't do it. I can't do it at all. There needs to be a better way to start podcast interviews.
This is a cold open. We're fine. You're good. You don't have to pretend.
Well, the whole point is to be very realistic, so here we are. Simon, I met you in person through Francesco. I knew of your work ahead of time, but for people who strangely haven't found you yet, which is weird for me to think of, who are you? Where are you living? Give us a 30-second synopsis of Simon Levin.
Simon Levin is a wood fire potter. I live in Springfield, Illinois now. I have a train kiln here, and up north where I used to live in Wisconsin, I have a cross draft and an anagama. I run an apprenticeship program. I work really hard to make good pots that I believe in, that I'm invested in. I make things that I think that hold my interest. I don't make things that I think will sell. I make the things I want to make, and then I sell that. And then I do a lot to try and lift up the clay community because it's really been so good to me. And I really love the clay community. So I'm on the board of NCECA as the director at large, which sounds impressive, but it's not so much. Let's see, we have 3 directors at large. I'm in charge of international residencies and the emerging artists. So I get to talk about people that are doing cool things and help bring spotlight to them. I also have a video series called Talking Clay, where I'm trying to bring dialogue into Ceramics Arts Network. They have this huge library of videos that are mostly how-to videos. In the age of DVDs, they were filming all these wonderful how-tos with great artists, but conversation about the why to, about the what, those things were missing. So it's this funny mix. I was likening it to Wayne's World, in the sense that they had this, it was in the time of, it was not really a TV show. It's a video series that's on this platform.
Okay.
Right?
I'm following.
Yeah. So Wayne's World was supposed to be on, late night cable channel, right? It was in that age. And so there's that element. And then with the pandemic, we had to cancel several interviews where we're actually interviewing people in person with high quality camera filming and sound. And I pitched to them the idea, let's take advantage of this Zoom webinar. And so we started doing field trips where we go visit people in video Zooms and invite people along for free. And we can go to Taiwan. We've been to Norway. Our next stop, we're going to do visit Lisa Orr in Austin, Texas. We can bring attention to artists that are like Virgil Ortiz, who's a Pueblo native, and his work. So I went from Wade's World to now we're the Magic School Bus, and I'm Miss Frizzle, right?
You've got to pick your curls out farther then to be Miss Frizzle.
I'm more Mr. Frazzle than Miss Frizzle. Yeah, because we got this Magic School Bus, we can go anywhere. We could go and take people with us to visit studios. And we're starting to kind of have this really cool thing, which is the sort of a narrated, no, it's not quite narrated. It's more like this dialogue demo combination where you have me interviewing a person while they're demoing. And so we get to talk about things that are important to them, about why they're making, but we also oh, did you just attach a coil there? Why did you do it on the inside instead of the outside? And these questions are coming in through people texting them. The audience can ask questions, but they text them or through the messaging app, and they get fed to me, and then I ask the presenter. So I don't know, that it feels like a really potent platform to have some really great clay conversations. All that to say that, I'm deeply immersed in this community that I love. I make wood-fired work. I only make wood-fired work. I'm still entranced with that process. But that making of objects, of handmade objects, pots for the home, has never been limiting. It's taken me to learn how to build kilns, and I built kilns around the world, in Taiwan and East Timor and China, as well as colleges and universities in the United States. And I'm an evangelist for clay. How about that? There, I summed it up. Simon Levin, an evangelist for clay.
That's amazing. What I think is really interesting is you were focusing, to me, on so much of the educational pieces that you're doing now when, full-time studio potter, right? You're not connected with the university. You're not teaching in air quotes as far as the formality of a semester program. Obviously, the apprenticeship program you have going is a whole different bag of tricks, but that's not fulfilling someone's credits or anything like that.
I've not been institutionalized, is what you're saying.
You're not with the man. You're separate from the man. But I do think that gives an interesting frame to the education side, because at least in my experience of my undergrad experience, I learned a lot of great technical skills and knowledge and the actual act of a craft, but I didn't learn a lot of, so now how do I make a living from this?
Right.
There's a lot of other notes I've taken to get back to the things you brought up, but talking about you're making things you want to make and then you're figuring out how to sell them second, that's a very different thing. And then I'm sure that comes up with the conversations you're having with other makers.
Absolutely. Yeah, when you go in the studio and I'm making things, I've gotten better at it and more articulate about talking about it over the time, but I've tried to remove the influence of the outside into what I'm making. And in that way, it feels more earnest, authentic, right? And it's really hard to do because, if I sold a lot of pictures, I should make more pictures. That's smart business. And then it starts to go down this line like, well, can I use less clay? Or how do I make this picture faster? How do I put more handles on quicker? And then efficiency is what's driving the object. And it's these outside influences that are coming into the studio to make decisions. And I want to look at that handle and I don't want to say, oh man, that was really efficiently made. Like those pots are so efficiently made. I want the handle to be fat and generous and soft. And I want you to see my presence in the moment about what I liked about that handle. Art is this communication from the artist about their own value systems, about what they think, about what they hold dear, where they're present in it, via an object to the user. And it's less interest to me to make it about what I think the user wants. But it's not a valued statement. That's just my own interest. Stacking bowls. Stacking bowls are incredibly useful, practical. They take up less room in shipping, right? They take less room in your cupboard. Great reasons to do it. But that reason doesn't interest me. The reason for stacking bowls is what could I do with those shapes? What's the top view of them? What's the profile of them? Are they all flat and level? Do they mound up? Do they become a tower when you stack them? What purpose does it serve to stack them? Do they become a centerpiece on the table? Those are much more interesting questions to me because it's about the effect of the object instead of the role of the object.
That's super interesting. Is there anything that you do to catch yourself in a way? Because I imagine the outside is always trying to get in. It's like scraping at the door, at least in my mind.
Yeah, have you seen Instagram?
Right. Okay, so cell phones are left outside the studio door. There's no phones. But generally thinking though, I think that's a wonderful practice and something I want to apply for myself and trying to think tangibly around, okay, what are some habits or practices you could put in place to start trying to keep yourself focused on?
Yeah, I have had this conversation yesterday with a couple of my students. I'm running this I envisioned a very different type of workshop, a year-long kind of workshop called Clay Cohorts, where I take on very limited number of students over a year period, and we meet basically 3 times a month. Once as a class, twice individually, and it's critique, it's whatever they want. But what it does is it explodes that 2-week intensive Penland workshop, which are fantastic over time. So I have rapport with the students and I can hold them accountable because I get to know them and I get to know what they don't know and I can suggest what they don't know. So we're talking a little bit about how do you make money? And there's several models out there about how artists make money, which is people who try and create a line of work that they're known for. And it's basically a catalog that they can produce that's reliable and low thought, and maybe you can even outsource the making of it. This is what the leech pottery did. Leech pottery had a catalog of standard ware. And in a way, it's great because it gets handmade objects out into people's hands and they start connecting with the handmade and variation. I never wanted to do that.
Yeah.
Because I just didn't want to spend my time making things I wasn't invested in. If clay is precious and I love it, why would I want to treat it in an insincere way? I mean, the pressure is, okay, how do you make a living so that you can make what you want to make? I mean, that's really the question.
Exactly.
Regardless of how you answer it, that's the question. And so one way is, I always thought if I lived in a larger city, it being a firefighter would have been a great way, because a lot of fire departments have 3 days on, 4 days off.
Yeah, so having that separate job that's totally not even associated with the arts.
Right.
Yeah.
Would protect that space.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of it is about protecting space, right? And then recently, so I started the cohort class because of COVID. Sales were down. People are a little more worried about money. All these workshops were canceled, and traveling shows and sales were canceled. So the cohorts was an adaptation. I like teaching. I can teach. It lifts up the clay community. It extends dialogue, all those things that I'm interested in. I'm paid well for it in a consistent way. And then my studio time's still protected. I started making tile, and that's something I can have apprentices do. I can outsource that. But I believe in the tile. The tile are modular. I don't think I've seen anything like them. They're wood-fired tile. I can't wait to see more of them installed in places. I'm making some that we're firing the next firing that I'll install in my home as well. That's a thing I can do that doesn't feel like it has any influence on what I make.
So it's like trying to find that magical connection between, in some ways, the tile is efficient enough to sell at a supportive rate, for lack of a better phrase, but at the same time, it's not taking away the space you need for thinking and exploring and discovering other new things. It's kind of trying to find that balance between both.
Yeah, and I love the tile. I think it's when you're making things that you're not loving. That's the problem. I'm talking to one of my students about cultivating enthusiasm, cultivating that energy in the studio. How do you cultivate that desire to go into the studio and make? And it's really hard if you're making things you're not invested in. So I just didn't want to do that. So I think a lot of it is monitoring your own thought process about where your ideas or influences are coming from. Are they coming from all the likes you got on that one post on Instagram, which feels great? Or is the idea coming from people asking for more of the thing that you made? I mean, there's objects I still make that people ask for, but as soon as I stop being interested in them, then I'll stop making them, which is bad business, right?
So being realistic about that, how does that flush out in, I mean, you have now been a studio potter for
30. Well, I've been making clay pots for about 30 years. I built my first studio in 99. That's when we moved. I finished grad school and then moved to Wisconsin in 99.
So there is an aspect of, like, you've made a living from this now for multiple decades, and so there is a way to do it, clearly.
There is a way to do it. I've gotten better at it. We should talk a little bit about this. I have had a safety net. My wife has had a job, so that's all provided health insurance. So that has not been a concern. I always chose the low overhead, high rate of return method. Like, I didn't want to buy the downtown studio with a rent that was going to drive everything. If I had to make $1,000 rent a month just for the studio.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's like it gets in your head.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. It's also something I find super interesting about ceramics in particular is that most of the most successful ceramicists I know live relatively remotely. Now, also, a lot of those people are wood firers, so that comes with the territory. But it's interesting to me because my professional experience in the arts world is so connected to being seen, being remembered, staying top of mind. And so it's fascinating to me how, at least it seems specifically in ceramics, you can grow a business and a viable living without having to be in the center of that city, where, like, how that connection works and how that side of it works.
Well, the internet has been hugely liberating, right? I used to live in a county of 40,000 people. If I had to sell locally, I would have never made it, even with low overhead. I've done a lot of different types of marketing. I try and keep selling through galleries to keep my name out there, but we could have a whole conversation about galleries and what makes a good gallery. I've come to think of galleries as my advertising budget, that they take 50%. And so I'm paying them. I'm hiring them. And what do I want for that money, right? Prestige. I want them to promote my work well, not to sell it, but also promote it, help keep me in the forefront of people's minds. Yeah.
The flip side of that also is the internet is super helpful, but it also means that it's competition in a way is now universal as well. So there's a shadow side as far as talking about protecting time and protecting space. Now you have to learn how to market on the internet in order to find those audiences rather than just show up to a show that, their branding is alignment with yours. So the audience who's going to show up and buy things in person are going to be your people.
Yeah, but they're just different learning curves, right? Learning how to sell work and building a booth for an art fair that highlights your work well, and knowing which art fair to go to and how to talk to people and invite them into the booth, and how to make sure you get their mailing list so that when you come back next year. Those are similar things to learning how to sell online and what's effective sales. It was fascinating years ago to talk to marketing people and really try and figure out marketing. So this is my approach, is I have the things I make, and then I try and spend time figuring out how to sell that instead of figuring out what sells and making that, right? That's the reversal. I've been working hard to try and get better and better at selling things. Malcolm Gladwell's book I always recommend is Tipping Point, because it's so good at making you understand how things get popular, how connections are made. And he said some really smart things. He talked about the strength of weak connections. Potters are great at this. We talk to other potters all the time, which is great for spreading information within our group, but it's shitty for promotion, because the people you know are most likely the people I know. And I already told them about the sale I'm having. And so you telling them about the sale that I'm having, we're just keeping it in this insular community. Much better that I tell my dentist. Much better that I promote outside the community. The change in algorithms on Facebook and Instagram has been really, I think, detrimental, because it keeps it more insular. It bubbles it, right? And so there's this echo chamber thing. So the trick is, how do you get outside that? And so I'm always kind of looking for ways to do that. Another thing that was a really great little tidbits is, if I can tie my success to your self-interest, not just you. Sorry, I'm not meaning to pick on you.
The universal you.
Right.
You can't see Simon's pointing to me on Zoom.
I'm pointing
to your.
at you. I'm gonna ride the train of your self-interest to my success.
Let's be real. We met in person purely because of my self-interest.
Is that what you call Francesco, your self-interest?
I mean, in some ways, right?
Okay. Yeah, I realized that I could, if I can be a resource, people will come to me because they will benefit from it. I was going to pull this up on Instagram. It's a really fascinating example of it. I posted a little while ago a little demo of making a tulip bowl. And the metrics on it are what I wanted to show you, and I'm having trouble talking and clicking at the same time. So it was a demo just doing this little tulip bowl off the hump. It's a faceted tulip bowl. Okay, so 648 views, and then most recent post is already 1,000 views, right? So that one with 1,000 views, way more views, almost we're edging into 1.7 times, right? It has 44 saves. 44 people saved it. Just a picture of a pot. But that little demo that you could do, and you can learn from and do, that has 93 saves. It's because of their self-interest. Oh, I want to do that. I want to try that.
Yeah.
That's one way to connect people to what you're doing. So one method I started employing back in the early 2000s was trying to write an article every year. And it could be a useful article, like about stopping ass cracks from happening. It could be about critical care and how you do self-critique and the role of self-critique. Just it gets your name out there. It's free promotion or you get nominal pay for it. It's a resource. It adds to the clay community and the sort of what's out there, what's available out there for resources for people. So to go back, I'm separating out the marketing, trying to keep also involved in doing marketing I love to figure out a way to do that in a way I like. And one way I'm doing that now is like the Talking Clay is marketing. It lifts up the community, but it talks about the things that I'm interested in, love, and it makes me present in the larger community.
The interesting thing that I'm thinking about with just bringing up that Instagram post also is you're monitoring different statistics or data, I should say, in terms of like looking at the saves as opposed to obsessing over the number of likes, or having a clear goal to say, I want to connect with more people. I want to provide content that people are going to find helpful for their own practice. Therefore, the actual data I want to look at is saves. And that really, I think, flips it on its head in so many ways, in the sense of like, when it comes to spending your time marketing, instead of looking at everything and going, oh my gosh, Instagram just launched Reels, so now I have to do that, or when they did stories, or when they did this, now I have to do. Instead, it's staying focused to say, here's my goal, therefore, here's the data that matters, and this is where I'm going to spend my time.
I'm trying to be better about that and responsive instead of reactionary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It'd be totally worthwhile. I'm seeing more potters on TikTok or doing TikTok, which is fun, right? That's reaching outside the community. Because there's that insular quality to Instagram. And I have to be careful because what do I want to be known for?
Exactly.
I want to be known for the pods.
Yeah.
The pods are what? And we haven't really talked about them. I know the thrust of this podcast is more about business and that interaction. I want to be known for the pods and for making just beautiful objects that are compelling. So it often takes time to go back to that because I can get carried away in all the other duties that I've said yes to. But that's why I protect space.
So, real life, how that plays out, do you set a certain amount of time every week? Again, just thinking tactically, is there protected time every single week where you never will take a meeting on Mondays because that's a throwing day, or like any kind of, I'm such a systems person.
You are a systems person. So I was smart about the clay cohorts classes, the 2 cohort classes, and I stacked the, like yesterday was teaching all day, Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting. But and now that's done for, I won't see those folks for another 2 weeks, right? And that's perfect. I mean, it's really good time and everything. It was a great day teaching and we're on task and focused. With pandemic, since I'm home all the time, now it's okay, maybe I'll try and spend 2 hours responding to emails and doing that stuff. I know if I get in the studio and make things early on in the day, then I'll come back to them in the evening. So I kind of force myself to get more studio time that way. But we're refinishing an office space upstairs, taking off wallpaper and refinish the bathroom. So maybe try and get a day a day. And I used to be better about the big blocks of time. With pandemic and this weird sense of time I'm in, not picking up kids after school or coaching soccer in the afternoon, or I don't have to be as protective about it because I'm here and I can just go in.
Which is really interesting because I've almost found the opposite in a way that I realized, okay, I finally have the time that we've all always talked about dreaming of, like, oh, if only I had a week where I didn't have any meetings or I didn't have anything, then I could XYZ, and realizing, oh, actually, now I have all of those weeks with no meetings, and I'm still saying then I could. For me, I really have to, if it doesn't get put down on a calendar, even if it's just for myself, I mean, we put a wheel in the kitchen now, and I realized we'd had it here for 2 weeks, and I'd only thrown once because I didn't just say, all right, from this block of time to this block of time is when I'm going to throw. I'm not going to let anybody schedule anything in that time. I'm not going to answer emails. I'm not going to do anything else. And once I start doing that, then it happens.
Yeah. I think partly I've built a habit of it, and the studio is refuge as much as, or more than it is work. It's the space where no one else can tell me what to do, right? You know. So I've curated it to be the place I want to go, and have the habit of it.
So what does the balance look like? I mean, I know there's not a set schedule, but just kind of, you have a lot of balls in the air as well as far as the apprenticeship program, and that helps and assists your making in your studio practice, but that's also time teaching while you're making, I imagine, that, you know, can affect what that time looks like. And then the NCECA work, and you do so much for the clay community, that's still a commitment on your time. So what does managing those things look like? Because at the end of the day, you were saying you want to be known for your pieces, so the primary focus still has to be keeping this studio practice afloat to sustain your life, right?
Often a constant reminder to go back to that. Yeah, right now I'm in a space where I don't have apprentices. Both Brian and Dan finished up their time here, and the next apprentice, Mike, will come in May. And it's nice having the whole studio to myself.
You're leaving stuff on wheels, using multiple wheels.
Well, I haven't used multiple wheels, but now I have 3 tables. So I have one table I'm working, it's for tiles and setup for tiles. The other ones I'm making these wood-fired tabletops and putting wooden legs on them and exploring that and playing with LEDs embedded in epoxy resin. So I'm making holes in the pots, then firing them and then filling the holes with epoxy resin and playing with colors on those. God, I'm in such a good place career-wise and art-wise, in that, like, all the prejudices and about all the shoulds in my head are gone. So when I learned about making pots back in 1990, and, you know, there was this love of the handmade such that there was a suspicion of anything that was a way to reproduce. So slip casting was suspect, that, you know, you wanted to be more natural. Right? And we weren't even talking about 3D printing. That wasn't even on the radar. Right now, it's a great time to make pots because it doesn't matter how you get from point A to point B. It's the quality of the object. And so all those shoulds about what I should be making, what it should do, those are gone. I think in the way we're seeing the object and the possibilities much more clearly. So, yeah, inlaying LED lights into wood-fired stoneware, you know.
Why not?
Yeah, but I could have told you why not 10, 20 years ago. Because that's wrong.
I mean, don't get me started on the color temperature of LEDs and why you should use tungsten or something, but that's a different story.
It's not a photo shoot.
Light still matters, Simon. Come on. Light still matters. But no, we talked about this a little bit back in the fall when Francesco and I visited the studio in terms of the difference in the US world specifically. I think you mentioned we don't really have a tradition, right? And so I'm going to mess up the beautiful point the two of you were making, that difference between if you're still potting in the UK and that there's this huge tradition and style and everything that people are really maybe trying hard to break away from, whereas we don't really have that structure in place. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, so we have a really weird relationship with tradition, I agree. In Japan, when I went there, this was 19 years ago, it was really fascinating to see all these traditional pots that were just shitty pots. In the same way, in the United States, you see all these pots that are innovative but shitty, right? Because there isn't conceptual anchor or understanding. And years ago, it almost has the quality of the stuff of legend. But Mark Hewitt, who comes out of the Michael Cardew, Todd Piker, English ware tradition, as opposed to the Leach tradition that Warren McKenzie and his students, Michael Simon, Linda Christensen, Randy Johnston, Sandy Simon, Mark Ferris, that those two lineages are prevalent in the United States. And Mark Hewitt was going to have this conversation with Garth Clark, who New York gallery owner, art critic, curator, commentator, provocateur, about the role of tradition. And Mark was pretty nervous about it and getting well prepared for it. And he found this great quote from Bertolt Brecht, which is, tradition is tending the fire, not worshiping the ashes. And I think that's what I was seeing in Japan. When you're making traditional pots, because that's what you were taught, you don't have an understanding of the rules such that when to break the rules, you can make something heartless that is correct in the same way that you can make something passionate that is incorrect. That art, you need the emotive, you need the visceral, you need the connection to what you're doing. And so making traditional pots doesn't make them good. Making innovative pots doesn't make them good. And so in the United States, we have this weird relationship with, what's new. And I think it's getting better, because I'm seeing less of the sense of, and I could be wrong here, but I'm seeing less of that prejudice about doing it the right way kind of idea, or what you should, or hand-made, or a process being disregarded because it's too mechanical. I think we're moving away from that. But maybe I think we still value innovation really highly, and that can be to our detriment. And I'm very aware when I teach that what I'm teaching, I'm a formalist. Form is, and the interactions of the elements of form are really the vocabulary I speak, the language I speak. And I wonder how much disservice I'm doing to some of my students by not making them aware of that enough, so that they have perspective on what they're being taught, so they're liberated from it. They realize it's only one perspective. I had a really interesting conversation with Julia Galloway, she's just a great woman. She's a monster in the clay community. She started if you don't know it, she started the field guide for ceramic artists, which, even though she teaches at a school, she realized that schools are falling down on the business side of art. And so it's a resource for people. Where are residencies? Who should you talk to? What are apprenticeships? What are business options? Yeah, helping people try and figure things out. And I built the apprenticeship based on what I would have liked to have had at that time in my life. The resources, the guidance, the mentorship, the push, the accountability, and the freedom. My guess is, I haven't asked her this, but Julia Galloway built that field guide based on what she would have loved to have had as a resource coming out of grad school or going into grad school.
You mentioned the apprenticeship program again, and I wanted to, for pure curiosity also, because as I'm trying to look for ways to learn and improve my own craft, what's interesting to me is, what are the options outside that formal schooling? And apprenticeship programs, workshops seem to keep popping up as far as the way to learn from reputable makers. But how that actually works for people, right? Like it's an obvious stepping stone to me for someone coming out of an undergrad program or coming out of grad school and going straight into that, because presumably their life is still set up around those structures of that education. But how that might work for a 34-year-old who's looking to leave Chicago. And how that works for people's actual personal lives. The apprenticeship program's a year, 2 years?
There's a 3-month escape clause. It's a year minimum. Often apprentices stay longer, a year and a half or so. Mike Gesikowski came to me as an apprentice after having been spent 10 years as a graphic designer. So he came as an apprentice at the tender age of 36. incredibly bold move to quit a full-time paying job. And his father was, like, you're quitting your full-time paying job to go work for free for this guy as an apprentice? It did not compute. It did not make sense. But it directly related to Mike's happiness.
So how does the program work, so to speak, as far as either working with you, but also just functionally, because people are coming from all over and living in rural Illinois, which is also an experience unto itself, having grown up there. But their families are moving with them and working remotely?
If they have families, often they're younger and without families. For a long time, it's felt like the apprenticeship sat really well between BFA and MFA, if you're going to go to MFA. Many of my apprentices have not followed that route. They've stayed in the field, but have not pursued an MFA, like Kenyon Hansen or Tom Yazchuk or Hannah Meredith. They didn't go that route. So some of them have. Lars Volz, who was an apprentice, came to me after his MFA, and that was a really good experience and different because it's a different time in your making career. Apprentices work for me 18 hours a week, and in exchange, I offer them facilities. I pay for materials, instruction. They come with me on kiln building or come with me to workshops. So there's opportunities. And what we're trying to do is they make what they want to make. They don't make my work. They're making tile, but they don't make plates that I will trim or finish. They don't do blanks in that way. And I want them to make what I'm trying to help them find their voice in clay, which means really trying to get them invested in what they're making and realize when they're not paying attention and take ownership of the decisions that they're making. When you start making a decision in a pot is where your personality comes out. How fat do you want that rim to be? Instead of making that rim that you were taught to make, when you realize you have options and then you make a choice in your option. When you make a choice about the handle attachment, where it starts and ends, how thick it is, how wide it is, what kind of handle you like, when you're really taking ownership of those things, you're making decisions. So a lot of my job is just constantly trying to get the apprentices to fully engage in the decision making and figure out what they like, what drives them, what they respond to, what holds their attention. And a lot of it is really just trying to really get them to be honest with themselves, because it's so easy to kind of it's not really lying to yourself to have a fascination with the process and be excited about it, but you may not be seeing the effect of all the other things. When you first learn how to facet a pot, you start faceting everything. And maybe you shouldn't be faceting everything. What is the effect of that facet, that process? Really trying to see it and be honest about it and be honest about how you respond to it. And then go back in and be intentional in the decision making. So that's sort of the apprenticeship in a nutshell. And it takes time, and over a year and a half, if it's gone well, the conversations in the studio are just kind of exciting dialogue of what you could do or what really works or what's exciting and where they're engaged and what they want to do next. It's curating a conversation in the studio such that you want to go back and have more of that conversation.
Which has got to be exciting for you as well. And that drives your own work forward.
Absolutely. Do you know the term compersion?
Ooh, no, actually.
Compersion is the opposite of jealousy.
Okay.
It's feeling excited along with somebody. It's not really empathy. It's like watching them discover and become the power of engagement or the pride of making and connecting with the material or getting invited to send work to a show, watching one of the students get that. Yeah, that's a great experience.
Well, for someone who's, this is kind of a hobby that they want to dig into more, or who's trying to leave a job to do this full time, either one of those, there's two different aspects my head is thinking about. My head is thinking about, on the one hand, just the act of becoming a better maker and learning more about the craft. Because from my experience, it's very tricky to filter out all of the resources that the internet has created 3 years ago when I very first started, I could watch a bunch of YouTube videos and not realize I was learning a ton of bad habits because the way somebody was centering or pulling was actually not. I know this is ironic because we were just saying that we're falling away from the goods and the shoulds, but there's some basic skills that maybe, like being on center.
It's good to know the rules so you know when to break them,
Right.
and when you're breaking them, and you're breaking them for a reason
especially when you're just learning.
Yeah, I wish though, when they're teaching people, especially people who know how to think, when they're teaching them how to throw, they're also teaching them concept, because a pot is a concept, clay is concept, art is concept, craft is making, craft is method, art is concept. That concept can be method that you're exploring. Craft is not concept. If you were coming here and you're learning how to throw, I'm teaching you the craft of throwing, right? I also feel like it's really important to teach the concept, how to push you to think about what's important, what the effect is, what are your options along the way. So we're teaching concept simultaneously. And it tends not to be how we seem to do things in the United States. There's only one potter I know of who was taught to throw loose from the get-go, and that's George Macaulay, who was a student of Ron Myers. And you watch Ron Myers throw, and he's totally relaxed and familiar with that clay. You know, there's trust and love. You know how, like, when people throw a cylinder and then they stop touching it, or the wheel stops, and we learn to be afraid of it. We learn this fear of loss of what we've done, and we don't want to touch it anymore, or this idea of perfect and throwing something perfect. What ends up happening, though, is clay is this recorder of information, and your touch is being recorded on the clay. And if you're touching it with fear like that, the pot's going to feel like that. So imagine if you were touching that clay and working with it like it's this old friend, and you trust it, and you trust what it's going to do, and it trusts you, and you're able to just interact with it in this really lovely, kind of intimate, familiar way. Your pots would look really different than if you were afraid of messing it up, if that's the kind of the experience. And that's what, like, watching Ron work with clay, the way he draws and touches the clay, the way he Linda Christensen, same, the presence with the clay, even at different times in the drawing versus the throwing, it's all just in this unified, relaxed, and that's what the clay is communicating, is that intimacy. So the craft can be really important. It's sort of like in writing sentence structure. It can help you communicate, like avoiding the obstacles that get in the way. Craft can do that really nicely. Like, you take a picture of your pot and you got too much glare, it's hard to see the pot. So you can craft that better to see the object. Or poor sentence structure putting the comma in the wrong place can change meaning, right? The interesting thing is, what are you taking a picture of? What's the content? And don't get me wrong, I think beautifully crafted work is a joy. Like, when I buy furniture, I see some really beautifully made pieces, and pull them out, and the back is just masonite stapled on. I feel betrayed. Because they had the skill set. They knew how to do it.
They just stopped.
But all of a sudden they stopped. And we get to see the value of the maker and their choices by making things that are beautifully crafted. But you ever read a poem by a kid or somebody who has not been really taught standard sentence structure? I think of the term ebonics, right? Where it's just different sentence structure. But it can be as or more articulate in how words are put together differently, in a fresh way. Language is always changing, and it's sort of the emotive side is core, such that you get to, it brings up Duchamp, who is trying to, like, can we remove craft from the making of an object? Can art exist without craft? What about the ready-mades? The recontextualizing of an object is the art, not the object. right? Now, you could have teased Duchamp and said, wow, that's such a beautifully crafted idea. But there was a rise several years ago in the unskilled objects. It doesn't matter if the pot falls apart later. It wasn't well crafted, but what an interesting object. And why is it exists, and how articulate is it about expressing the concept? Maybe skill is less important in the same way crafting is less important. But maybe skill's in the value system. If I'm trying to talk about eloquence and elegance, poor crafting is probably not going to serve the purpose.
There always has to be like a balancing act between the two. You have to have a certain level of skill in order for your hands to literally make what it is you're trying to say from a concept perspective.
Unless what you're trying to say is, I'm just coming in and I'm learning this material. It's about this kind of moment of interaction, first moment of interaction with new material.
There's always the
I know. Art does that. It dodges the bullet always.
Right.
It absolutely does, which is hard. What makes it hard to define what art is. But art can be about crafting, and it can be not about crafting. Crafting can't do that.
Sure.
It's because art is about concept, and concept is kind of this
moving target,
much broader moving target.
So you would say crafting is about skill, basically.
Crafting is about skill, articulation.
Mm-hmm.
Crafting is much more measurable, right? If I set you up with an assignment to throw, here's a pound of clay, throw a 10-inch cylinder. All right, we can measure that. And then we can cut it open and see where the weight is, how even your walls are. Now we're talking about crafting, right? It's measurable. It's much more like science, right? You've got this quantifiable thing. But if I give you a pound of clay and say, throw an angry cylinder, now we're in a really different world, right? Like, how do I tell that you've made a more angry cylinder than Francesco, right? I don't have a unit of measurement. I don't have an angriometer to do that. But I do have my visceral kind of reaction to it.
Sure. Oh man, I have no segue from this cover. I think this is just the eternal question, isn't it? This is where we just have to leave everyone hanging and say, "Yep, good luck."
It just ends like just a mic drop, and then
Yeah,
just leave a minute of silence at the end of the podcast. Maybe a humming noise.
But really, I mean, this is the eternal conversation, isn't it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's a new conversation for a lot of people coming in and trying to figure those things out. It's not a new conversation for me because I have strong opinions about it, and it no longer holds a lot of interest in a debate. This is just how I think about it, and it is what it is for me. I think you have to find your own kind of space with that, like how important is crafting to you in the making? And if it's the end all be all, why? People try and talk about it as a decision making. Like if the spout doesn't pour well, it's a bad pitcher kind of idea. I would rather it dribble and drip when you stop pouring and be an elegant pitcher that just breaks your heart in beauty than it stop that stream of water flow, litter your table. I'm looking for the object that compels me. Again, like I'm not a service industry. Service can be beautiful. Steve Rolfe makes beautiful pots. He wants them to be the workhorse. And so his concept is about that, about making pots that serve. I don't do that. That doesn't interest me as well. My concepts just have different value system, different weight, different direction.
Well, and it seems to me taking the time to discover what that value system is and then making choices that are intentional.
Yeah.
Regardless.
And then marketing that.
Full circle. There it is.
Full circle. There you go.
Ta-da!
Yeah. So you make what you believe in, and then it's so much easier to market it because you're talking about what you love, which is easy. I love this. Look at this. I love this. Look what happened. Oh my God, that's so exciting.
Oh, absolutely, because that's where I think the reason so many people think of marketing or business as a dirty word is because it's when you're trying to sell something that you don't believe in that it gets used car salesman slimy. Like when you believe in it and you're passionate about it no matter what, the way I talk about albums and prints, that's the thing that's driven my photography business for years, because it's like, this is the thing that's going to exist in 80 years. Like I'm already going off on it, and all I was trying to do was use it as an example. But, oh gosh, there's so much more, and we started this talking about protecting time and space, and I want to respect yours, and I know we're pushing well past an hour on you here, so...
It's been a really lovely conversation. Thank you for putting this together. Edit it however you want. Chop it up.
Nah. We'll leave in all of the terrible jokes at the beginning.
Terrible? I don't remember you making any jokes.
If you're interested in following more of Simon's work, including those handy tutorial videos and clay conversations, check him out on Instagram @Woodfire. Yep. He's like Prince, a one-word Instagram handle. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of The Maker's Playbook. If you're enjoying these conversations, please consider taking the 60 seconds to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this podcast. As always, if you don't want to worry about any pesky changes to algorithms causing you to miss an episode, click the link in the show notes to jump on our Insiders email list. Being on that list gives you quick, simple updates for each new episode, but it also gives you access to my top photography tips for ceramicists and other makers that I don't share anywhere else. Until next week, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Together, we've got this.